Well, hey everyone, it's Elita, one of the pastors from the Way Church, and we're so glad that you have tuned in to listen today. And wherever you're listening from, we pray that this message that you're about to hear strengthens you in your walk with Jesus. Enjoy.
Good morning, everybody. Today's teaching text comes out of Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Do not be afraid. Just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. Let me ask you a question as we get going in our time together today. What were you doing 12 years ago? Maybe some of you were just finishing up high school. Maybe others of you were just, maybe just born. That's how we have a young congregation. Maybe some of you were just finishing up elementary school. Maybe some of you just gotten married or had babies. Maybe some of you are sitting here still trying to do the math on when 12 years ago was. That would be me if you had asked me. So let me help you out. The year was 2012. And just to remind you, to bring your mind there with us, Canadian gas prices were $1 in 2012. The average Canadian gas price in 2012 was about $1.28 a liter. You know, I thought it would have been lower, actually, but yeah, that feels pretty good today from where we're sitting. Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister in Canada. Barack Obama had just been reelected to the second term as being President of the United States. Carly Rae Jepsen's "Call Me Maybe" had just come out. True story, I thought that was a Taylor Swift song, so I learned something new. Wow. 9 a.m., judging hard. Okay. All you sports fans, Henrik Sedin was the captain of the Canucks at that time, who, by the way, and I debated on whether or not I would share this, but I'm committing. Tuesday night, small group, we watched the hockey game, and I honestly and seriously said, which one is Henrik Sedin? And my small group they went, oh, Elita. And I think they lost a little respect for me. But anyways, maybe you did too. I bring other things besides sports knowledge, okay? What else was happening in 2012? Facebook had just bought Instagram. That was a new thing. The iPhone 5 had just come out. Some of you still have the iPhone 5, maybe. Snapchat was a whopping 6 months old at that time. A lot can happen in 12 years. I know for me, like our family had just moved here to Vancouver, to BC. I had a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old at home. I was homeschooling. Like my life looked so very different back then. Like I said, a lot can happen in 12 years. Now, let me invite you to maybe just go a step further in this reflection and ask you, how would you, just in general, describe these last 12 years? If you could just pick a couple of words, how would you generally describe how these last 12 years have been for you, what your life has looked like? Maybe for plenty of us here, we'd say that while the last 12 years hasn't been any kind of perfect, it's not been pain-free, maybe it's just been kind of like pretty good. Pretty good. Highs and lows, but pretty good. Not 12 years of perfection, but maybe 12 years of goodness, some delight in there. Maybe for others of us, though, here or joining us online, maybe this thought experiment takes your heart and mind in a different direction. Maybe for some of us, as we reflect on these last 12 years, we would remember loss or heartbreak, or we remember an illness during that time period. Maybe some of us might remember the day a diagnosis came in or an unexpected phone call came through that changed everything. For some of us, maybe we reflect on these years and we think, man, I really just thought life would look different by now. I thought I'd be further along. I thought I'd have the job, or I'd be married, or I'd have the house, or I'd have the kids by now, or maybe I thought that I would have just really dealt with that addiction by now, or I'd have more answers about my health by now. Or maybe some of us are here and we're thinking, I actually just thought that God would have come through for me by now. I thought that by now he would have answered that prayer or would have met that longing and would have helped me to deal with this. Maybe some of you in the room can identify with Proverbs 13:12, which says that hope deferred makes the heart sick. And so some of us here might remember these last 12 years not primarily as years of delight, but as years marked by disappointment and deferred hope. The story we've just read in Mark chapter 5 is one of my favorite stories in the Gospels. And actually, as you heard it, hopefully you noticed it's not just one story, it's actually two stories that are kind of positioned together, kind of sandwiched together on purpose. And the first story begins with a father who for 12 years has had a healthy little girl. She is the apple of his eye. And in this story, we see that suddenly, very unexpectedly, she gets sick. And as we heard, she tragically dies before the story is over. It's also the story of a sick woman, an outcast because of her illness, a woman who has tried everything she knows to get well and has been suffering slowly and painfully and in isolation every single day for 12 long years. One scholar notes that Jairus' story was 12 years of delight, while hers was 12 years of despair. Two very different stories, two very different people, but despite their differences, both end up finding themselves at the feet of Jesus, desperate for him to intervene in their lives. And interestingly, both end up experiencing the phenomena of having to wait on Jesus. And I don't do this every Sunday. In fact, I think I rarely do this, but I want to go ahead and give you the title of today's message because I think it's going to help us wrap our minds around where we're headed today because there are so many different directions that we could go. In fact, Paul and I were just talking about this. He was like, what are you going to do in this passage? I was like, man, there's so many things you could do, but this is what we're doing, and this is the title of today's message. The title of the message is When the Wait Feels Too Long. When the wait feels too long. Because sometimes the wait does, if we're being honest, feel too long. Sometimes the long suffering just feels too long. For some of us, maybe we thought the thing that would just be a footnote in our stories has actually taken up whole chapters of our stories. And so my prayer for us today has been that as we sit together in this story and as we look at these two people who have to wait on God, one for years and another just for moments that must have felt like a lifetime, that as we sit in this story, we'll be encouraged as we see how Jesus enters into both of their situations. So here's our roadmap for the day. We're going to move through this story together, and we're going to look at three things. The first thing we're going to look at is the request of a desperate father. Then we're going to look at the interruption of a desperate woman. And then we're going to look at the unhurried nature of Jesus. So first, the request of a desperate father. Look back at the text with me, beginning in verse 21. Let me just get there. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him. "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. So the story begins with a man named Jairus. And Jairus comes to Jesus and begs him to come and heal his suddenly sick 12-year-old daughter. And we know that she's 12 because if you keep reading, and we heard it read already, but if you keep reading to the end of the story, Mark makes sure to let us in on this fact. It's very intentional of him to let us know that she was 12. So who is Jairus? Well, Jairus was, or is in this story, he's a synagogue leader. And all sorts of implications would have come with that. It likely would have meant that he was wealthy and a very respected member of the community, somebody who would have been very well known, someone of importance even. And not only that, but as a ruler in the synagogue at that time, he was a religious leader. And if you've been with us in this series, one of the things that we've seen over and over again is that the religious leaders are constantly in conflict with Jesus. In fact, they're the ones who've already begun to plot Jesus' death. And this is the camp that he's associated with, that Jairus is associated with. So right out of the gate, the story is kind of loaded with tension because here comes Jairus in full view of this crowd that is now surrounding Jesus, likely full of people who knew exactly who Jairus was, who knew that even if only by association what camp he was in, that they did not like Jesus. And he falls on his knees before Jesus and begs, "Come with me, please, come heal my little girl." And in this moment, Jairus was not thinking about how bad this might look on his reputation as a synagogue leader. Any caution he might have had about his reputation had gone out the door. Why? Why? What was Jairus thinking? Well, he was thinking of his daughter. 12 years of memories. 12 years of watching her grow up, watching her hair grow longer and longer. 12 years of laughter and stories and snuggles. 12 years of blessing her on Sabbath evenings and praying and believing for what she might grow up to be one day. 12 years of joy and delight. 12 years of kissing her on the top of her head. And now suddenly, very suddenly, the rug is being pulled out from underneath him, from underneath their family. And so Jairus does the only thing he knows to do when he comes and he throws himself at Jesus' feet. Who cares about his reputation? And there is really so much that could be said about this, but for the sake of time, I want to simply take note of Jesus' response in verse 24. Verse 24 says that Jesus went with him. He pleads with Jesus and Jesus goes with him. And this is such a tender picture to me because, the backstory here is that Jesus has been doing ministry for a while. He was on the other side of the lake doing ministry, and now he's come over with his disciples, and just he gets off the boat, and people are already surrounding him. A crowd is already formed, and then as this crowd is around him, Jairus just kind of rushes at him. And what we don't see is Jesus getting annoyed with Jairus. Jesus does not see Jairus as any kind of an inconvenience. He didn't say, "Listen, could you just give me 5 minutes to get settled, okay? Could I just grab something to eat? Just hang on a second." He also didn't say, Jairus, interesting that you're coming to ask me because I know who you're associated with. I know what camp you're associated with, and I know that the people that you're working with are plotting to kill me. He doesn't say any of that. All he says is that Mark doesn't say any of that about Jesus. Mark just notes that Jesus went with him. And I think this is so powerful because it shows that when we come to Jesus, even in a rush, even in a hurried state, and we're in need of something like immediately, right now, he doesn't look at us annoyed. He doesn't say to us, okay, listen, just start over. Could you start with please maybe? He doesn't do that. He's not like there's a formula here. You start with the Lord's Prayer, then you ask for what. He doesn't do that. I mean, to be sure, there are times when we come to Jesus and it's more in like a contemplative posture, and we're just like a heart of gratefulness. But I think he gets our humanity, that there are very much times when emergencies happen, when the only thing that we can muster up is help me now. Please, just help me. That's all we've got. And I think that this is what Jairus' story shows us. And it also shows us that we're welcome to come to him just like no matter what camp we're in, no matter what our history is, no matter what our previous associations have been. Anne Lamott is a writer, and she tells the story of when she first came to faith in Jesus. She had been an agnostic, and she was determined not to believe in him. And she was, in her own words, a foul-mouthed alcoholic drug addict who'd been raised to think Christians were idiots. But one day, surprisingly, even surprising to herself, she found herself at the feet of Jesus. And I found this so touching when she tells her story, because she said that when she first prayed, she had this like real palpable feeling that as soon as she called on Jesus, despite all her thinking beforehand about who he was or who he wasn't, that he was still there welcoming her. Not at a distance from her, but actually happy to answer her just immediately, and had this sense of like he'd always been there and that she could come exactly as she was, despite what her history had been. And I think that Jairus' story here shows us that there's just no camp that we're in, that when we come to him, he's not just going to welcome us, like with ready, willing, and open arms, as we are, with our doubts, with our fear, with the past, with addiction still in tow. When we come to him and we say, help me, Jesus, he doesn't turn his back on us. He makes time for us, for all of us. And so off Jesus goes with Jairus. And you have to know, like, if you are this little girl's parent, you're not just like going at a leisurely pace down these, roads. You're not just strolling along, just chatting it up. You are moving fast. You are determined to get somewhere because you know that every single counts. And probably every single person who's in that crowd has to be seen as some sort of an obstacle, like, get out of my way. We have got somewhere to go. And maybe some of you have been in this kind of a situation before where you had an immediate need and you came before the Lord and you're like, not tomorrow, Lord, like now, not even tonight, like right now. I need you to show up right now. And this is what was happening with Jairus. So they're on their way. They're moving along. And just as they get going, they get interrupted. And can you imagine? Jairus is forced to wait while his daughter is dying at home. So let's sit in that tension with him as we head into this second observation, which is the interruption of a desperate woman. Let's pick up reading in verse 24. It says this: a large crowd followed and pressed around him, around Jesus. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. So on the way to Jairus' house, Jesus, and ultimately Jairus as well, end up getting interrupted by this woman. Now, a few things to note about her. She's sick, obviously, but her particular issue is one that made her unclean according to Jewish law. in the book of Leviticus, you could read about this, but in Leviticus chapter 15, it notes that when you have an unclean status, you're not allowed to take part in any aspect of Israel's worship. And this would have been her. Because she was unclean, she wouldn't have been able to go even into the synagogue, for example. Not only that, but also according to the law, she actually would have been banished from being in the city. Because according to the law at the time, if she touched anyone, she would have made that person unclean. She would have transferred her uncleanness on to them. So for her, it's not just that she would have avoided being in crowds like the one that we find her in, it's that she's not even supposed to be in them at all, according to the law. She's not even allowed in them. We know that she was poor because the text tells us that, or Mark tells us that she had spent all of her money on doctors trying to get well all of this time. And so we have to understand her situation, that she was living as an outcast really for 12 years. Not welcome and not able to be around other people. And just think of what this would do to a person psychologically, that amount of time, and emotionally and even spiritually. And if we can just go back in our minds a few years, many of us would have experienced this to a smaller extent during COVID. Like having to do the 2-week quarantines where you can't be around people or touch people. You couldn't be with your loved ones. Or even when you had to do your circle, you couldn't be around other people in your circle. Or, outside your circle. You couldn't be around loved ones. And that was so hard. And it's been a few years. But many of us would remember that. And I get that. I didn't get to see my parents for almost 2 years. And I'm not trying to minimize the gravity of that season and how hard it was for many of us. I just want to help us understand that for her, for this woman, like to put it in perspective, 12 years. 12 years. 12 years of suffering. 12 years of constantly declining health, because that's what Mark is sure to tell us, is that she was progressively getting worse over time. 12 years of day in, day out isolation, 12 years of disappointment and frustration, of meeting with doctor after doctor, spending so much money and hoping for something, anything to work, but never finding a cure. And you have to know that the longer a thing like this goes on, the lower she probably sank into despair, when over and over again things were not working. And so I wonder what happened when she began to hear the news of Jesus. We're not sure how she heard, of course, but somehow the news had made it to her. And I wonder if by this point she had already kind of landed in this spot in her life of just constantly having given up hope, of going, well, I guess this is just my lot in life. This is just how it's going to be. I wonder if after so many years of despair, if she was surprised when, against all odds, after hearing the news about Jesus, hope started to make its way up inside of her. And we know that it did, because at some point she made a very real decision. Because this is what the text tells us, if I could just get to him, I'll be healed. If I could just get to him. And so what does this mean for her? It means she's having to break the law. She's going to go into a crowd and make her way to him. And so she does. She makes her way through the crowd where she's not supposed to be. She reaches out and she touches just the hem of his cloak. And in verse 29, it tells us that immediately her bleeding stopped. And she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Now remember, according to the law, she was unclean. Therefore, according to their thinking of the day, because she was unclean, when she touched Jesus, that would have made him unclean, according to their thinking of the day. But the opposite happens. That is not at all what happened. When she touched his garment, Jesus was not made unclean. She didn't transfer her uncleanness onto him. Instead, he made her clean. So beautiful. He made her clean, made her whole. And this is what Jesus' holiness does for us. He makes us clean. Now, hers was in a physical but also a spiritual sense, but this is true for us in a spiritual sense as well, which I want to suggest as part of the bigger message here, that when you and I encounter Jesus, the living God, that when we come to him in desperation, our stuff doesn't rub off on him. He makes us clean. He makes us clean. And I don't know your story, but I sure know mine. And I know what was in my ledger. I know the list of my sins, know them well. And I remember very well the day that I fell at his feet, literally in desperation. And I remember what it was like when truly only moments later, I could feel like in my bones that I was forgiven, whole, and completely washed clean. One of the biggest miracle moments of my life. I don't know what's in your ledger, but I do know that there is absolutely nothing that he can't deal with. That there's nothing that would make Jesus Christ shy away from you. He can deal with all of it. He can make you clean, make you whole. And after 12 years of waiting for this woman, 12 years of waiting, can you imagine her suffering, her pain gone in an instant? Meanwhile, poor Jairus. While this whole thing happens, he's still standing there watching this all unfold. Her waiting is over now, and his has just begun. But can you imagine for him watching all of this, the irritation, the frustration, the desperation? He had to be thinking, hurry it up. Because then Jesus goes on to have a conversation with this woman, as we have already read. And he must have just, probably wasn't tapping his toes, but in his mind going, we got to go. Wrap it up. Do your thing so we can move on. Which brings us to our final observation for the day, which is the unhurried nature of Jesus. The unhurried nature of Jesus. Look back at the text in verse 35. It says this: while Jesus was still speaking to the woman, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. I don't know if you have felt it or not in this story, but Jesus does not seem to be in any kind of hurry at all. I mean, like, I read this story even in my own time. Every time I've ever read the story, I feel in a hurry for Jesus. Like, I'm like, okay, you did it. Let's go. Let's move. But Jesus is not in any kind of a hurry. Someone once asked Dallas Willard, the Christian philosopher, they said, if you could describe Jesus in one word, what would that word be? Without skipping a beat, Willard said, relaxed. Jesus was relaxed. And I love that. You've maybe heard me say that before. It's like one of my favorite quotes of all time. But here's the thing, because this is what I was thinking about this week. I love that quote until I don't, you know? I love it until I don't want a relaxed version of Jesus. Sometimes I want him to be as frustrated as I am. Sometimes I want him to just hurry up. Sometimes I'm like, I don't need you relaxed today, Lord. I need you to be as hot and bothered as I am. I want you to feel pressured about this like I do. Just maybe not as pressured, but just at least like a little bit. I just want to feel a little. Sometimes I just want him to do the thing, and a lot quicker, thank you very much. I mean, like, it's cool that Jesus is relaxed in theory, but in actual practice, man, it can grind on my patience. I love to quote it, but when the time comes that I actually experience his relaxation, his unhurriedness, in a moment where I want him to speed up, it feels hard. Because sometimes he just feels too slow. Kazuki Kayama, he's a Japanese theologian. He wrote a book called 3 Mile an Hour God, and he says this: God walks slowly because he is love. If he is not love, he would move much faster. And I was thinking about that quote this week, and it occurred to me how time-consuming love actually is. Like, think about that relationally, even in your own life, in friendships, marriages, with children. Cultivating love, the real deal kind of love, takes real time. It takes maybe a disproportionate amount of attention and tending to. It can't be rushed. John Mark Comer says it this way. He says, hurry and love are incompatible. And we see this in the life of Jesus. Like, if you read the four Gospels, one of the things, and not just in this story, but like over and over again, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, when you read the Gospels, one of the things we see is that Jesus was just rarely ever in a hurry. He just wasn't. He was not rushing from place to place. We don't get a stressed out version of Jesus. And in this story, he didn't even let a medical emergency or an anxious father rush him into the next moment. Because as we just saw, he was fiercely present with that woman, with the sick woman, completely unhurried to move on as he talked to her. Now, he hadn't forgotten about Jairus or Jairus' daughter, yet he took his time. After 12 years of waiting, just imagine this woman, after 12 years of waiting, him taking the time to turn around and talk to her and hear her story because she tells him everything. It must have felt like such unhurried love to her that he stood and chatted with her and heard it. Of course, meanwhile, as we know, Jairus' worst fears, the worst case scenario has happened. His daughter has died. Now, we don't know how he responded to this news because the text doesn't tell us. Mark doesn't tell us. If it were me, I don't know if I would still be standing up. But I love what Jesus says to Jairus. He looks at him and he says, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." Other translations say, "Don't be afraid. Keep believing." Now, I want to be really clear that Jesus was not minimizing the gravity of what had just happened. That's not what he was doing. This was not just like a trite, just believe, okay? Let's keep going. This was more like Jesus inviting Jairus in this moment of absolute panic and unbelievable, unimaginable pain for him in real time to fix his eyes again on Jesus and to trust him. It's almost like Jesus is saying to Jairus, "Jairus, you trusted me before. Do you trust me still?" In the unexpected delay, in this waiting now, do you trust still that I'm good, that I care, that I can still save your daughter? Do you trust me? And I wonder for some of us if that's not a question that we also have to consider in our own waiting, in our own delay, in times when it feels like panic and pain have set in, and you've been believing for a while, but something has happened that's made you go, "I don't know if I can do it anymore." If the invitation from Jesus is, "Do you trust me?" I'm going to invite James to come on up to the keys. We don't have time to get into all of the story today, as I've already mentioned, but we know the end of the story. We've already heard it read. Jesus goes to Jairus' house and brings his daughter back to life. It's beautiful. This 12-year-old girl gets healed, resurrected. The woman sick for 12 years gets healed. So then here, I think, is the maybe obvious rub when you read a story like this. At least it's the rub for me. What happens when you've been waiting and this is not the way your story ends? What happens when the thing we're begging for doesn't seem to happen, or when the waiting just continues to keep on going and keep on going, when hope continues to feel deferred, or when the healing doesn't happen. And I wish so badly in moments like this that I could just stand here before you, before all of us, even for my own soul, and go, well, here's a 3-step plan for faith, and you just do 1, 2, 3, and then great, let's go have lunch. Like, I wish. But that's not life with Jesus. His way is not mechanical. It isn't one size fits all for all of us. It is, as we've just read, often very slow and unhurried. And I want you to know that I stand here as someone experiencing this in very real time. Like none of this this morning is theoretical for me. Ryan, my husband, and I, we were talking about this morning, and we were just reflecting, like, we have been praying for over a decade, and I mean like daily, for the Lord to meet us in a specific area. We have begged him. We have cried. And we are still waiting. Still crying out like the psalmist, how long, O Lord? How long will you delay? And to be sure, there are practical ideas I could give us, things that we could do in our own time to read and pray the Psalms. It's great. You should do that. Keep getting every day and trying in your best broken way to follow Jesus. You should do that. Stay in community while you wait. That's great. And that's all true. It's good stuff. But where my heart and mind went this week in preparation for this was Isaiah 53, which tells us that Jesus is well acquainted with our grief. He's not far off from it. That him taking on human flesh meant he took on all of it. He knows our pain and our suffering. He experienced many of the things we will experience. Loved ones dying. Just so many other things. Sickness. He knows what we experience in our humanity. I've also been reading or rereading the Chronicles of Narnia series lately, just for my own. It's not with my kids, just for me, because it builds up my faith. And there's this beautiful scene in the book called The Magician's Nephew. And there's a boy named Diggory, and he's discovered Narnia, and he's met Aslan, the lion. And as you probably know, Aslan is meant to be like the Jesus figure in this book. And in this story, Diggory's mother is dying. And he's trying to work out a way to ask Aslan for help. And so finally he comes to Aslan, and Diggory pleads. He says to Aslan, but please, can't you give me something that will cure Mother? Up till then, he had been looking at the lion's great feet and the huge claws on them. Now, in his despair, he looked up at its face. What he saw surprised him as much as anything in his whole life. For the tawny face was bent down near his own, and wonder of wonders, great, shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. They were such big, bright tears compared with Diggory's own that for a moment he felt as if the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than he was himself. My son, said Aslan, I know. Grief is great. This is the picture I needed this week of Jesus pulling up close to me in my pain, tears pooled in his eyes. Elita, I know. The grief is great. And this is the picture that Scripture gives us of him. Like I said, Isaiah 53. Jesus not immune to our pain and suffering, grieving with us, for us, and perhaps, as Diggory says, he even feels it deeper than we could possibly comprehend. I want to encourage you, friends, there will be days, maybe years, when the wait feels too long, when we wonder if he hears us, wonder if the healing will come or the answer will come, and we will wonder if we have the endurance to get up another day and keep going. On those days, on this day, may we all hear the words that Jesus spoke to Jairus again over our lives. Do not be afraid. Keep believing in me. You can trust him. We can trust him.
Well, thank you for listening to today's sermon. And hey, if you want to get connected with the church or learn more about us, you can find out more online at our website. It's thewaychurch.ca. Thanks again for listening. God bless.